In the pre-dawn hours of June 4th, 1942, a U.S. Navy radio man in a cramped basement bunker at Pearl Harbor scribbled a string of 5-digit numbers onto a yellow pad of paper. His hand shook not from cold, Hawaii's humidity hung thick in the air, but from the weight of what he was reading. The message, pieced together from fragments of coded Japanese transmissions, revealed a secret so large it could either save the United States or seal its fate in the Pacific. This was not a report from the front lines. It was a window into the enemy's mind, and it would launch the most decisive naval battle in modern history, fought not with guns first, but with brains. When Japanese aircraft roared over Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, they struck at America's military heart, but they missed its hidden nervous system. Across the United States and its Pacific outposts, small teams of cryptanalysts, linguists, and intelligence officers had already been waging a quiet war against Japan's most closely guarded secrets. Their battlefield was not a beach or a ship deck, but a maze of codes, radio waves, and raw data. At the center of this effort was a converted administrative building in Pearl Harbor, where the doors bore a simple sign, Station HYPO. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of tobacco, typewriter ink, and exhaustion. Commander Joseph Rochefort led the unit, a man whose rumpled khakis and unruly hair gave no hint of his genius for pattern recognition. A former surface warfare officer who'd taught himself Japanese, Rochefort had a knack for seeing order in chaos, a skill that would prove invaluable in cracking Japan's primary naval code, JN-25. JN-25 was designed to be unbreakable. It used a complex system of code books, random number tables, and additive ciphers to scramble messages beyond recognition. Every Japanese naval unit, from Yamamoto's flagship to the smallest patrol boat, relied on it to communicate. For years, U.S. intelligence had struggled to make sense of the garbled 5-digit groups that poured in over the radio waves. But by early 1942, HYPO's team was making steady progress. Linguists spent hours cross-referencing decoded phrases with known Japanese military terminology. Traffic analysts tracked the habits of individual radio operators, recognizing their unique sending rhythms the way most people recognize a friend's voice on the phone. They mapped the location of every Japanese ship and base by monitoring where transmissions originated, noting changes in call signs and frequencies that signaled movement or new operations. One of the team's earliest breakthroughs came when they identified recurring references to a target labeled AF. Debates raged for weeks in HYPO's war room. Some analysts believed it referred to Hawaii itself. Others pointed to Alaska or Australia. Rochefort was convinced it was Midway Atoll, a remote cluster of islands 1,300 miles northwest of Oahu that served as a critical refueling station and early warning post. To test his theory, he proposed a risky deception. Without seeking approval from Washington, Rochefort coordinated with Midway's garrison to send a plain text message reporting a failure in the atoll's freshwater distillation system. 2 days later, a Japanese transmission was decoded. AF is short on water. The confirmation sent a jolt through the unit. They now knew Japan's next major target, and the clock was ticking.
By May 1942, the intelligence floodgates had opened. HYPO's team, working in tandem with other units like Washington's Station Nugget and the British code-breaking operation in Singapore, was decoding hundreds of messages a day. They learned that Japan planned to launch a two-pronged attack. A diversionary force would strike the Aleutian Islands to draw U.S. ships north, while the main fleet, led by Admiral Yamamoto, would seize Midway and destroy the remaining U.S. Pacific Fleet. Yamamoto's plan was a masterpiece of strategic deception. He believed the U.S. carriers were still recovering from the Battle of the Coral Sea, fought just weeks earlier, and that Midway would be lightly defended. With Midway in Japanese hands, he could establish a forward base to threaten Hawaii, cut American supply lines to Australia, and force the U.S. into a negotiated peace. But Yamamoto was operating in the dark. He had no idea that U.S. intelligence had not only broken his code, but had built a detailed picture of his entire order of battle. They knew the names of every carrier, cruiser, and destroyer in his fleet: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, and dozens more. They knew how many aircraft each ship carried, when they planned to launch their attack, and even how much fuel they had on board. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, faced an impossible decision. His forces were severely outnumbered. Japan had 4 fleet carriers to the U.S. 3, plus a massive armada of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. If he committed his carriers to defend Midway and was wrong, he could lose America's last major naval force in the Pacific. If he waited, Midway would fall, and Japan would control the central Pacific. Nimitz chose to trust the intelligence. On May 28th, the carriers Enterprise and Hornet slipped out of Pearl Harbor under cover of darkness. The Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea, had been repaired in just 72 hours, a feat of engineering that seemed impossible. Workers had cut away damaged sections of the flight deck, welded on new steel, and refilled fuel tanks while the ship was still in dry dock. By May 30th, she too was at sea, heading for a rendezvous point northeast of Midway, codenamed Point Luck.
For the men of HYPO, there was no time to celebrate. They worked in 12-hour shifts, sleeping on cots in corners, surviving on coffee and sandwiches. Every message was critical. Every delay could mean disaster. Lieutenant Jasper Holmes, one of HYPO's lead linguists, later recalled how the team would gather round a large map of the Pacific, moving small wooden markers as new information came in. It was like playing chess with the fate of the nation, he said. Every move we made had consequences we couldn't even imagine.
At 0247 hours on June 4, Ensign Jack Reed lifted his goggles and rubbed his eyes. He'd been patrolling the dark waters north of Midway for hours in his PBY Catalina, scanning the horizon for any sign of the Japanese fleet. Then he saw it, a blip on his radar screen, faint but steady, moving southwest toward the atoll. He radioed back to Midway, sighted large number of ships bearing 320 degrees, distance 700 miles from Midway. The battle had begun. At 0430 hours, Japan launched its first strike wave, 108 aircraft heading for Midway. The atoll's defenders were ready. Marine Corps fighters rose to meet them, while Army Air Force's bombers took off to attack the Japanese carriers. The skies over Midway erupted in flames as American pilots fought against overwhelming odds. Many were shot down, but they inflicted enough damage to disrupt the Japanese attack and buy time for the U.S. carriers to act. Meanwhile, the American carriers were launching their own strike forces. Enterprise and Hornet sent out waves of dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters, while Yorktown prepared her aircraft for a second wave. The plan was simple: find the Japanese carriers and destroy them before they could launch a counterattack. The early going was brutal. Torpedo planes from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 attacked first, flying low over the water toward the Japanese fleet.
Without fighter cover, they were sitting ducks. Japanese Zero fighters swarmed them, and in minutes, all 15 planes were shot down. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in the water for hours as the battle raged around him. Torpedo planes from Enterprise and Yorktown followed, with similarly devastating results. But their sacrifice was not in vain. By drawing the Japanese fighters down to low altitude, they left the carriers exposed from above. At 10:22 hours, dive bombers from Enterprise's Scouting Squadron 6 and Bombing Squadron 6 appeared out of the clouds, right over the Japanese fleet. The timing was perfect. The Japanese carriers were in chaos, rearming and refueling their planes after the strike on Midway, with bombs and fuel lines scattered across the flight decks. In just 5 minutes, the course of the war was decided. Bombs slammed into Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, turning their decks into fireballs. Akagi, Yamamoto's flagship, was abandoned hours later. Kaga and Soryu sank before sunset. The only remaining Japanese carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterstrike that hit Yorktown, causing severe damage. But Hiryu's luck didn't hold. Later that afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown found her and sent her to the bottom of the Pacific. By the end of June 4, Japan had lost all 4 of its frontline fleet carriers, ships that represented the core of its naval air power. The U.S. lost Yorktown and the destroyer Hamon, but retained Enterprise and Hornet, along with control of the Central Pacific. In the days after the battle, the full impact of the intelligence victory became clear. Every decision, from where to position the U.S. carriers to when to launch their strikes, had been guided by the information coming out of Station HYPO. The Japanese had been fighting blind, while the U.S. had been reading their playbook page by page. But the story of Midway's intelligence heroes did not end in triumph. Politics and inter-service rivalry soon took their toll. Commander Rochefort, who had led the code-breaking effort, was passed over for promotion and reassigned to a desk job in Washington. Some said it was because he had bypassed chain of command to execute the freshwater ruse. Others pointed to jealousy from senior officers who had doubted his conclusions. For decades, his contributions were largely forgotten by the public. The men and women of Station HYPO continued their work throughout the war, breaking new Japanese codes and providing critical intelligence for every major operation in the Pacific. They tracked Japan's remaining carriers, identified supply routes to target, and even helped locate Yamamoto's plane in 1943, leading to his death in an ambush by U.S. fighters. As the war dragged on, the lessons of Midway shaped how the U.S. military thought about intelligence. What had started as a small ad hoc effort became a formal part of military strategy. New technologies were developed to collect and analyze information, and intelligence units were integrated into every level of command. The idea that information could be a weapon, perhaps the most powerful weapon of all, had been proven beyond doubt. Today, the waters off Midway Atoll are home to the remains of dozens of ships and planes, silent monuments to the battle that changed the course of World War II. Divers who visit the site report seeing the outline of Yorktown on the ocean floor, her hull covered in coral, and the wreckage of Japanese planes scattered across the sand. But the real legacy of Midway lies not in the wreckage, but in the idea that knowledge can overcome overwhelming odds. The Codebreakers of Station HYPO were not warriors in the traditional sense. They were mathematicians, linguists, and clerks who spent their days in windowless rooms, staring at numbers and listening to static. But their work saved thousands of lives and ensured that the United States would eventually prevail in the Pacific. The battle also taught critical lessons about the importance of collaboration and trust. The intelligence effort at Midway was not the work of one man or one unit. It was a team effort that brought together people from across the military and across the globe. It required leaders like Nimitz who were willing to listen to their analysts even when their conclusions seemed impossible. In our own time, when information flows faster than ever and cyber warfare has become a new front in global conflict, the lessons of Midway are more relevant than ever. The ability to collect, analyze, and protect intelligence remains essential to national security. But just as important is the ability to use that intelligence wisely, to separate truth from misinformation, and to have the courage to act when action is needed. On clear days, when the sun is high and the water is calm, locals say you can still feel a presence over Midway Atoll, a quiet, steady force that guided the U.S. to victory. They call it the Ghost of Midway, not a spirit of war, but a reminder of what can be achieved when we use our minds as well as our strength.
Thank you very much for staying with us.